The Battle of Assaye was a major battle of the Second Anglo-Maratha War fought between the Maratha Empire and the British East India Company. It occurred on 23 September 1803 near Assay in western India, where an outnumbered Indian and British force under the command of Major General Arthur Wellesley defeated a combined Maratha army of Daulat Scindia and the Raja of Berar. The battle was the Duke of Wellington's first major victory and one he later described as his finest accomplishment on the battlefield. From August 1803, Wellesley's army and a separate force under the command of his subordinate Colonel James Stevenson had been pursuing the Maratha cavalry-based army, which threatened to raid south into Hyderabad. After several weeks of pursuit and countermarching, Scindia reinforced the combined Maratha army with his modernized infantry and artillery as the British forces closed in on his position. Wellesley received intelligence indicating the location of the Maratha encampment on 21 September and devised a plan whereby his two armies would converge on the Maratha position 3 days later. Wellesley's force, however, encountered the Maratha army, which was under the command of Colonel Anthony Pullman, a German formerly in British service 6 miles farther south than he anticipated. Although outnumbered, Wellesley resolved to attack at once, believing that the Maratha army would soon move off. Both sides suffered heavily in the ensuing battle. Maratha artillery caused large numbers of casualties among Wellesley's troops, but the vast numbers of Maratha cavalry proved largely ineffective. A combination of bayonet and cavalry charges eventually forced the Maratha army to retreat with the loss of most of their guns. But Wellesley's army was too battered and exhausted to pursue. Wellesley's victory at Assay, preceded by the capture of Ahmednagar and followed by victories at Argaon and Gwalior, resulted in the defeat of Scindia and Berar's armies in the Deccan. Wellesley's progress in the Deccan was matched by Lieutenant General Gerard Lake's successful campaigns in northern India and led to the British becoming the dominant power in the heartlands of India. Background: feuding between the two dominant powers within the Maratha Empire, Jashwant Rao Holkar and Daulat Rao Scindia, led to civil war at the turn of the 19th century. The hostilities culminated in the Battle of Poona in October 1802, where Holkar defeated a combined army of Scindia and Baji Rao II, the Peshwa and nominal overlord of the Maratha Empire. Scindia retreated into his dominions to the north, but Baji Rao was driven from his territory and sought refuge with the East India Company at Bahrain. He appealed to the company for assistance, offering to accept its authority if he were restored to his principality at Poona. Lord Mornington, the ambitious Governor-General of British India, seized on the opportunity to extend company influence into the Maratha Empire, which he perceived as the final obstacle to British paramountcy over the Indian subcontinent. The Treaty of Bahrain was signed in December 1802, whereby the company agreed to restore Baji Rao in return for control over his foreign affairs and a garrison of 6,000 company troops permanently stationed in Poona. The restoration was commanded by Lord Mornington's younger brother, Major General Arthur Wellesley, who in March 1803 marched on Poona from Mysore with 15,000 company troops and 9,000 Hyderabad allies. Wellesley entered Poona without opposition on 20 April, and Baji Rao was formally restored to his throne on 13 May. The treaty gave offence to the other Maratha leaders, who deemed that the system of subsidiary alliances with the British was an unwarranted interference into their affairs and fatal to the independent Maratha states. The Maratha leaders refused to submit to the Peshwa's authority, and tensions were raised further when Holkar raided into Hyderabad in May, claiming that the Nizam of Hyderabad owed him money. Mornington consequently engaged the various Maratha chieftains in negotiations. Lieutenant Colonel John Collins was sent to Scindia's camp to discuss his objections and propose a defensive alliance. However, Scindia had formed a military alliance with the Raja of Berar with a view to bringing the Maratha leaders into a coalition against the British. and had begun to mass his forces on the Nizam's border. Wellesley, who had been given control over the company's military and political affairs in central India in June, demanded Scindia declare his intentions and withdraw his forces or face the prospect of war. After a protracted period of negotiations, Collins reported to Wellesley on 3 August that Scindia refused to give an answer and would not withdraw his troops. Wellesley's response was to declare war on Scindia and Berar, in order to secure the interests of the British government and its allies. Prelude. The East India Company attacked the two principal Maratha forces of Scindia and the Raja of Berar from the north and the south. Of the other Maratha leaders, Holkar was hesitant to enter the war in cooperation with his rival, Scindia, and remained aloof from the hostilities. And the Gakwade of Baroda placed himself under British protection. Operations in the north were directed by Lieutenant General Gerard Lake, who entered Maratha territory from Cawnpore to face Scindia's main army, which was commanded by the French mercenary Pierre Perrin. A second British force under the command of Major General Wellesley confronted a combined army of Scindia and Berar in the Deccan. Wellesley was determined to gain the initiative through offensive action and told his senior subordinate, Colonel James Stevenson, that a long defensive war would ruin us, and will answer no purpose whatever. The Maratha army in the Deccan was largely composed of fast-moving cavalry able to live off the land. Consequently, Wellesley planned to work in conjunction with a separate force under Colonel Stevenson to enable his slower troops to outmaneuver the Maratha army, and force it into a position where it could not avoid a pitched battle. Stevenson was dispatched from Hyderabad with an army of some 10,000 men to Jafarabad to deny Scindia and Berar the chance to raid east into the Nizam's territory. In the meantime, Wellesley moved north from his camp near the Godavari River on 8 August with some 13,500 troops and headed towards Scindia's nearest stronghold, the walled town and fort at Ahmednagar. The bulk of his forces were company troops from Mysore, 5 sepoy infantry battalions of the Madras Native Infantry and 3 squadrons of Madras Native Cavalry. A contingent of European troops were supplied by the British Army and included cavalry from the 19th Light Dragoons and 2 battalions of Scottish infantry from the 74th and 78th Regiment of Foot. Irregular light cavalry were also provided by the company's Mysore and Maratha allies. Wellesley reached Ahmednagar later the same day after a 7-mile march and immediately ordered an escalade assault on the town rather than enter into a time-consuming siege. The walled town, which was garrisoned by 1,000 Arab mercenaries, upwards of 60 cannon and one of Scindia's infantry battalions under the command of French officers, was captured with minimal losses after a brief action. The adjacent fort's defenders capitulated 4 days later once the walls were breached by British artillery, with the fortification providing a logistics base and point of support for future operations into Maratha territory. Wellesley installed a garrison and headed north towards the Nizam's city of Aurangabad. Along the way he captured Scindia's other possessions south of the Godavari and established a series of guarded bridges and ferries along the river, to maintain his communication and supply lines. Murata Reinforcements. The Marathas slipped past Stevenson and advanced on Hyderabad. After receiving reports of their movement on 30 August, Wellesley hurried east down to the Godavari to intercept. Stevenson, meanwhile, marched westwards to the Maratha city of Jalna, which he took by storm. Scindia learned of Wellesley's intentions and returned to a position north of Jalna. Unable to make a clean break from the pursuing British, he abandoned plans to raid into Hyderabad and instead assembled his infantry and artillery. The combined Maratha army was around 50,000 strong, the core of which was 10,800 well-equipped regular infantry organized into 3 brigades, trained and commanded by European adventurer and mercenary officers. Colonel Anthony Pullman, a Hanoverian and former East India Company sergeant, commanded the largest brigade with 8 battalions. A further brigade with 5 battalions was provided by Begum Samru, and was commanded on her behalf by a Frenchman, Colonel Jean Sala. The 3rd Brigade had 4 battalions and was commanded by Dutchman, Major John James Dupont. In addition, the Maratha force included 10,000–20,000 of Bear's irregular infantry, some 30,000–40,000 irregular light cavalry and over 100 guns ranging in size from 1 to 18-pounders. After several weeks of chasing down the Maratha army, Wellesley and Stevenson met at Badnapur on the 21st of September and received intelligence that the Maratha army was at Borkardhan, around 30 miles to the north. They agreed a plan by which their 2 armies, moving separately along either side of a range of hills with Wellesley to the east and Stevenson to the west, would converge on Borkardhan on the 24th of September. Wellesley's force reached Pauji on the afternoon of the 22nd of September and departed camp before dawn. By noon, the army had marched 14 miles to Naulnaya, a small town 12 miles south of Borkardhan, where they intended to rest before joining Stevenson to attack the Maratha army the next day. At this point, Wellesley received further intelligence that rather than being at Borkardhan, the Maratha army was camped just 5 miles north. But their cavalry had moved off and the infantry were about to follow. At about 1300, Wellesley went forward with a cavalry escort to reconnoiter the Maratha position. The rest of his army followed closely behind apart from a battalion of sepoys left at Naulnaya to guard the baggage. In all, Wellesley had 4,500 troops at his disposal plus 5,000 Mysore and Maratha horse and 17 cannon. Aware that the British were nearby, the Maratha chiefs had positioned their army in a strong defensive position along a tongue of land stretching east from Borkardhan between the Kalna River and its tributary the War. However, Scindia and Berar did not believe Wellesley would attack with his small force and had moved off from the area in the morning. Command of their army was given to Pullman, who had positioned his infantry to the east of the Maratha camp in the plains around the village of Assay on the southern bank of the War. To his surprise, Wellesley found the entire combined army before him. Nevertheless, he resolved to attack at once, believing that if he waited for Stevenson, the Marathas would have the chance to slip away and force the pursuit to drag on. Wellesley was also eager to forge a reputation for himself, and despite his numerical disadvantage, he was confident that the Marathas' irregular forces would be swept aside by his disciplined troops, and only Scindia's regular infantry could be expected to stand and fight.